They say your home is the one place in this world that will never turn its back on you. I believed that for 23 years. And then, on a cold Tuesday morning in December, my own father looked at me across the dinner table, the same table where I had eaten every meal of my childhood, where I had done my homework by lamplight, where my mother had once kissed my forehead and told me I was her greatest gift, and he said 7 words that shattered everything I had ever known about belonging. You have 2 days. Then you leave. Not a conversation. Not a warning. A sentence. Handed down like a verdict. My name is Daniel Hargrove. And this is the story of how the people who were supposed to love me most became the reason I found my greatest strength, and how the boy they threw out into the cold came back as the officer who made them question every single choice they had ever made. But let me take you back to where it all began. Because you need to understand the world I lived in before you can understand what I became. I grew up in a mid-sized town in a family that looked perfect from the outside. My father, Colonel Hargrove, retired, was a man built from discipline, pride, and silence. He wore his military past like armor, and he expected the men in his house to wear it too. My older brother, Marcus, was the golden one. The athlete, the honor student, the son who smiled at the right moments and shook the right hands. My mother, a soft but easily influenced woman, followed my father's lead in everything, even when that meant following him off the edge. And then there was me. I was quieter. More inward. I spent my teenage years drawing, writing, listening to music that my father called noise. I wasn't rebellious, I was just different. And in a house built on performance and presentation, being different was the same as being wrong. By 18, I had stopped trying to fit the mold. I enrolled in community college instead of the military academy my father had mapped out for me. I chose literature and history over engineering and law. Every choice I made was, to my father, a personal insult, a rejection of everything he stood for. And Marcus, my brother, fed that fire every chance he got. He had always been jealous of the closeness I shared with our mother, before my father's influence drowned it out. So whenever there was an opportunity to make me look weak, irresponsible, or ungrateful, Marcus took it. He exaggerated. He invented. He whispered things into my father's ear over years and years, slowly building a version of me that had nothing to do with who I actually was. But what I didn't know then was how deep that poison had already spread. At 23, I was working 2 part-time jobs, saving money to transfer to a 4-year university. I was quiet about my plans. I had learned that sharing my dreams in that house only gave people ammunition. I paid rent. I cooked my own meals. I stayed out of my father's way as much as I could. I thought I was building towards something. And then the morning came. My father had received a call from someone at the college, or so he claimed. He said a professor had told him I was failing my courses, that I had borrowed money from a classmate and refused to pay it back, that there were rumors I had been involved in a public disturbance on campus. None of it was true. Not a single word. But my father didn't ask me for my side of the story. He never had. He sat at the head of the table, folded his newspaper, and looked at me the way you look at something you have decided to throw away. I didn't raise a liar and a failure. You have 2 days to get your things out of this house. I looked at my mother. She looked down at her hands. I looked at Marcus. He looked away, but not before I caught the corner of his mouth twitch with something that looked exactly like satisfaction. And right then, with my chest caving in and the world tilting beneath my feet, I made a decision. I didn't beg. I didn't argue. I didn't cry, not in front of them. I stood up from that table, walked to my room, and began to pack. 2 days. Fine. Then I would become someone they never expected. The first night on my own was spent in my car. I had $47, a backpack with 3 days of clothes, and a cardboard box with my books and a framed photo of me at 10 years old, the one where my mother is holding my hand at a county fair, and we're both laughing at something the camera didn't catch. I don't know why I took it. Maybe I needed something to remind me that I had been loved, once. Even if that love had conditions I never agreed to. I found a hostel for $11 a night. I stretched my money as far as it would go. I picked up extra shifts at a warehouse on the edge of town, stacking pallets from midnight until 6 in the morning. I ate gas station sandwiches and drank coffee that tasted like burned plastic. And every single night, I asked myself the same question, what now? But what I didn't know at the time was that being broken down to nothing is sometimes the only way to figure out what you're actually made of. 3 weeks after I left home, I walked past an Army recruitment office on my way to work. I had walked past it dozens of times before. I had always looked at the poster in the window, the one with the officer in dress uniform, standing straight and sure, and felt a complicated mix of my father's world and a world that might actually be mine. That morning I stopped. I went inside. The recruiter was a woman named Sergeant Torres. She was calm, focused, and direct. She didn't try to sell me anything. She just listened as I told her, in 3 sentences, that I had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. That, she said quietly, is exactly the kind of person we're looking for. I enlisted 2 weeks later. Basic training was the hardest thing I had ever endured. My body, unused to the relentless physical demands, broke down in the first week. My feet bled. My hands cracked. I failed my first physical assessment. My drill sergeant stood over me after that test and said something I will never forget. Every soldier I've ever seen quit in their head first. Your body is not the problem, Hargrove. What are you going to tell yourself right now? I stared at the ground for a long moment. And then I thought of that dinner table. I thought of my father's cold eyes. I thought of Marcus's smirk. I passed every subsequent test. The military gave me something I had never had at home, a structure that rewarded effort, not bloodline. No one cared what my last name was. No one cared about my father's rank or my brother's trophies. What mattered was whether you showed up, gave everything, and earned the trust of the people standing beside you. I showed up. Every time. Without fail. Over the next several years, I was promoted, not once, not twice, but consistently. I pursued officer candidate school and was accepted. I specialized in logistics and crisis management. I deployed twice. I led men and women who trusted me with their lives, and I never once let that weight sit lightly on my shoulders. By 29. 6 years after being thrown out of my childhood home with $47 to my name, I held the rank of captain. But back home, life had moved on in ways I was only beginning to learn about. My college roommate Jess, who had kept in sporadic contact with me, sent me a message during my second deployment. She said she had run into my mother at the grocery store. She said my mother looked older, tired, and that when Jess mentioned my name, my mother had pressed her lips together and looked away. She also said something else. Something that landed in my chest like a stone in still water. Marcus, the golden son, the one who had whispered and manipulated and smiled, had made a series of financial decisions that had devastated the family. He had borrowed heavily against the family home to fund a business venture that collapsed. He had borrowed money from family friends. He had lied about his income, his partners, his plans. And when everything fell apart, he had walked away, leaving my father to absorb the losses at 71 years old, and my mother to quietly mourn the life she thought she had secured. The golden sun had turned to ash. I sat with that information for a long time. I want to be honest with you, because this story deserves honesty. There was a part of me that felt something sharp and satisfying when I heard it. A part of me that thought, now they see it. But the larger part of me, the part the military had trained, the part that had grown up, felt something closer to grief. Because the collapse of my family didn't feel like victory. It felt like confirmation of something I had always feared, that the people I had wanted to love me were always too busy protecting the wrong things to see what was real. And yet, despite everything, or maybe because of everything, I made a decision that some people in my position might not have made. I decided to go home. I requested leave in the spring of my 30th year. I drove back to the town I had been exiled from in dress uniform, not as theater, not as performance, but because I had earned the right to wear it, and I refused to arrive as anything less than exactly who I had become. My father opened the door. For a long moment, he just stood there. And I watched something move across his face that I had never once seen directed at me in all my years growing up in his house. Recognition. And shame. He stepped aside without a word, and I walked into the home I had been told I had 2 days to leave. My mother was in the kitchen. When she turned and saw me standing in the doorway, taller, steadier, wearing the uniform of a rank that exceeded my father's own, she covered her mouth with both hands and began to cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears I had seen from her as a child. Something deeper. Something that had been held too long. "Daniel," she whispered, "I am so sorry." We sat at the dinner table. The same table. And for the first time in that house, I was the one who spoke without interruption. I told them where I had been. What I had done. What I had survived. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The facts of my life were louder than any argument I could have made 7 years earlier. My father said very little. But at one point, and I will carry this moment for the rest of my life, he looked at the insignia on my chest, and then he looked at me, and he said something that cost him more than I think he had ever paid for anything in his life. "I was wrong about you." That was all. 4 words. But from a man who had never admitted fault in 71 years of living, those 4 words held the weight of a full apology. As for Marcus, he came by that evening. He walked in and stopped cold when he saw me at the table. Whatever expression he expected to find on my face when we finally met again, the one I was wearing was not it. Because I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was simply present. Settled. Untouchable in a way that had nothing to do with my uniform and everything to do with who I had become without him in my life. We spoke briefly. I told him I didn't come back to collect a debt. I came back because I wasn't willing to let the story end with the door closed in my face. He nodded. He didn't have much to say. Men who have spent their whole lives as the favorite rarely know what to do when the room stops favoring them. I stayed for 3 days. I helped my father sort through some paperwork. I sat with my mother in the garden and let her talk about the years I had missed. I didn't pretend that everything was healed. It wasn't, and it wouldn't be overnight. But something had shifted. Something that had been locked for years had finally opened. When I left, my father walked me to my car. He stood straighter than I expected for a man his age. And then he did something I had not seen him do since I was perhaps 7 years old. He put his hand on my shoulder. And he held it there. No words. Just that. A hand on a shoulder, the language of men who have forgotten how to say what they mean, trying to say it anyway. I drove back to base with the window down and the early spring air filling the car, and I thought about everything it had taken to arrive at that moment. The $47. The warehouse. The busted feet in basic training. The deployments. The promotions. The years of building something out of nothing in the dark. And I realized something that I want to leave you with, because it is the truest thing I know. The people who underestimate you are not your enemies. They are your architects. Every door they close becomes a wall you learn to climb. Every word meant to diminish you becomes fuel for the fire they never saw coming. My parents said I had 2 days to leave their house. And they were right, I did leave. But I left as a boy they had given up on, and I came back as an officer they were forced to respect. I didn't just rebuild my life. I built it in the military. I became the man they once called a mistake, and the officer the world called Captain Hargrove. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Being cast out does not mean being cast away. The harshest rejections from those we love most can become the very ground where our strongest selves take root. If we choose to grow instead of collapse. Not every revenge is loud. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is return, quietly, firmly, undeniably, as living proof that they were wrong.